we have Brendan Bullock. Brendan is a photographer and artist living in Bowdoinham. He grew up fishing freshwater in Vermont, but is now trying to figure out how to ice fish for smelt. So far, without much success, maybe 2020 is the year. Come on up, Brendan.
Hello. So, can you all hear me? Should I take this out? How's that?
Nice. That's great.
So my father was an older man. He was in his 50s when I was born, which means that by the time I was in my late teens, he was in his 70s. And what that means is that he had an entire lifetime, basically before I was born, that I would only hear stories about, and I would kind of imagine what my dad's heyday had been like. And at one point in the around the Vietnam War era in the 60s, he bought a farm up in Canada and hosted all kinds of libertine experiments up there with free-minded people. But he also did a lot of fishing. And there was this one place up in Quebec that he used to go fishing for lake trout. And I always used to hear stories about this one place that was, according to him, the best lake trout fishing anywhere in the world. It's about 200 miles north of Montreal, up in Quebec. So he would always say, someday I've got to get you up there to that spot. We've got to get up there to that spot. But he was getting older, I was doing my own things, and we didn't get out and have as many adventures together. Well, fast forward to when I was about 16 years old, I went up to Northern Ontario. One summer I was fortunate enough to go do a 200-mile paddle up into Northern Ontario, and I came back from that trip feeling really pumped about my canoeing and paddling skills. Not necessarily my navigational skills, but my paddling skills. And maybe it was because of that trip that Dad said, you know what, this is the year. You've got that experience under your belt. This is the year we should go up to those lakes and we should go fishing. So we made a plan to go up in the summer, and we made the drive from southern Vermont up past Montreal up into this very rural part of Canada. And the place where we went fishing is, hi buddy, you want to come up? This is weird. The place where we went was a chain of lakes. And the way that it worked, you want to sit on the chair right here? The way that it worked, or was supposed to work, was that you start off in this, you go in, you register, you get a map, etc. You get your canoe, you go in, and if you follow this chain of lakes the way that you're supposed to, you make a circuit. So you paddle across one lake, there's a little feeder stream river that cuts down to the next lake, so on and so forth. You can, there's campsites at each one of the lakes. And by doing this over the course of 4 or 5 days, you can do the whole chain, and you basically kind of end up back where you started by some miracle of gravity and water flow. Well, we got a late start. We got the boat in the water late. It was probably mid-afternoon. We didn't look at the map probably as much as we should have, and we got paddling off, and we paddled down to the end of one lake. We weren't seeing much in the way of campsites. So we thought, you know what, I think everybody's filled up the campsites here. We're going to have to get over to that next lake, and we're going to have to go down the tributary. Well, we got to where the lake fed out into a stream that connected to another lake, except we realized we had gone the wrong way on the circuit. So instead of looking down a stretch, we were looking up a stretch. And it was, I don't know exactly how long it was, but it wasn't crazy whitewater. It was probably maybe a class 2, maybe a 1+. But I was feeling confident. It wasn't that long a stretch. So we said, you know what, if we really get up a good head of steam, we can paddle up this thing, and we can get up there, and you know, there's probably tons of campsites because nobody will have come around that way. So we got up a good head of steam, and we started paddling upriver, up through these rips. And we were giving it the old college try. We got about halfway up, and the canoe swung around. And the second it got perpendicular to the stream, the whole thing dumped over. And it was a moment of mayhem where the boat flipped over, I went under the water, I popped up just long enough to see Dad, who's a 70-year-old man, go under the water. Stuff floating, paddles going everywhere. And in this one moment, I remember grabbing a life jacket and I threw it to my father. And he grabbed it. I don't know how, in that moment, I don't know how that even happened. But he grabbed a hold of the life jacket, and then I just kind of focused on flowing out, and eventually went through the white water and out into the placid lake once more. And we then had a debris field of things that just slowly went out into the lake. And among the casualties was a very expensive downrigger, which we had bought specifically for lake trout fishing, which sank to the bottom. Certain other things sank to the bottom. We didn't have dry bags, so our tents, our sleeping bags, everything was soaked. Food stores, in large part, were soaked. Pretty much everything was soaked. So at the end of the mouth of this river where it fed out, Dad sat down, and I started making trips out into the lake, and I got out to where the canoe was. I flipped the canoe over and I brought it back. And I took another trip out, and I got these floating bags of tents and food, and I brought them back. And one by one, I got everything that was floating, and I got it back to the shore. And we sat there surveying our scene, and Dad said, "Well, this looks like a good fishing spot. We may as well." So we did fish for a while, but it was starting to get darker, and we realized we still hadn't even figured out where we were going to camp, and all the camps we'd seen were full. So we piled all the wet stuff back into the canoe, and we went across to the other side of the lake, and we found a place where clearly somebody else had been in a similar situation. It wasn't a campsite, but they'd taken a hatchet and they'd cut down some trees and kind of roughed out a campsite. So we thought, well, that's the best we've got, we'll do the same. There were some big rocks going up the side of the river, and we stretched out all the tents to dry and the sleeping bags to dry and the food to dry. And as I recall, we had a pretty miserable dinner of saltine crackers, whatever was inside a dry container. And the only thing that we had for shelter that wasn't wet was a tarp. So we strung up a tarp between 4 trees, and we planned to sleep there. Well, as the sun started going down, the mosquitoes were absolutely the most ferocious that I have ever seen. If you didn't have a net over your head, you'd suck in a good dozen of them on every inhale. Non-stop. We ended up tying trash bags around our feet up to so they couldn't get up inside our pants. Mind you, we're still wet. And eventually, with not having much else to do, we just lay down in this kind of depression of dirt underneath this tarp to go to sleep, and the sun had gone down. Well, I woke up in the middle of the night feeling very uncomfortable, and I didn't exactly know why I was feeling so uncomfortable. And then at a certain point, I realized I heard thunder and lightning. Mixed in the thunder and lightning. Just as heavy as it was before. And I realized that we were both lying in about 3 inches of water. We had found this little depression, and it was a perfect little collecting area, and the rain was running right off the tarp down in there, and we were just lying in water. And honestly, it was so bad. I remember just falling back asleep, and just going back to sleep and just dealing with it. So anyway, somehow we made it through one of the longest nights that I can recall, and in the morning we actually bushwhacked through a marsh, back out to the road, hitchhiked. Somebody picked us up, we got back to the car, brought the car back, and then we had to bushwhack, pull the canoe through the put stuff in there, and we just had to fold on the whole thing. And so that's what we did. And as a matter of fact, the trip just kept getting worse from there. But this trip's really about, the story is really about a fishing trip gone wrong. So I'll leave you with that much. But when I think back on the trip, what really sticks out to me the most is that moment of Dad and I tipping the canoe over, and it was a rite of passage of sorts, because it was the first time that I was the one who was in control, and I was helping my dad out, and for somebody who always looked up to an older dad, that was a kind of a moving moment, and one I still think about today.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Next we have Laura Robitzek. Laura has only lived in Bowdoinham for 2.5 years. She got a tip from her dad that the town seemed quirky. And since then, it has been a perfect fit. Laura.
So this story is about a duck calamity. So ever since I've been very young, I always wanted to live on a homestead.
Talk right into it. Yep.
I always wanted to live on a homestead. And so Sarah and I, my wife, we lived down in Brooklyn for 10 years. And so we were moving back here, and I was getting so excited and doing all the planning. And we moved up in winter, so I had like a chunk of time to like make these plans. And so we did a lot of research. We decided we were going to get ducks first, which I was like, yeah, let's do it. Everybody has chickens. We're going to do ducks. We found someone in Harpswell who was trying to downsize her flock, and we ended up with Muscovies, which they have this big red bit on their face, which is why they're most noticeable. But they're a wood duck, so they prefer to like roost 20 feet in the air if they can. So if you're going to try and domesticate them, like clipping their wings is a good idea. A painless process that just kind of keeps them closer to the ground. And they also don't make any noise, so there's no quacking. Like they kind of like let out a low hiss, like if a goose always had a sore throat, that's kind of like what it sounds like. But you can't really hear it from far away. Like it's very soft. All of this is important context. So we work early spring, we get a coop set up, and then it's like the first week of May, and we get these ducks, and we keep them close to home. So they have a coop and they have a run that's covered. So for the first week, they're just in there getting to know their new home. We clip their wings that first week, and then on one day when I'm not there, Sarah decides that she's going to let them out for their first time to kind of range around. And so she lets them out of the run, and turns out like watching ducks is a pretty boring. Like they just kind of like peck at the ground and are rooting around. And so she decides this is a good opportunity for some multitasking, and she goes into the house to get her cell phone. How far can ducks go? Foreshadowing. So she comes back out, and they are not there. And this is when I drive down the driveway. So she's just like, the ducks are gone. And it's starting to get a little bit dark. And so our property, we have a pond on one side, which we thought was kind of the obvious place to go looking for ducks. And then the bay is like down a steep hill. So we spend most of our time in the back of the house searching for these really quiet ducks that make no noise and can't like offer you any guidance as to where they are. And so we just don't find them. It gets dark, we don't find them. We kind of give up. I go inside and have like a good long cry about it, feeling like I've like failed already. Like within 6 days, we've lost our ducks already. And also we had been texting with this woman who like gave us her prize ducks like every day. She's sending her pictures. Like, how are we gonna tell her? How are we gonna tell her that we lost her ducks? So the next day I go out, and at that point our house, we didn't have any grass yet. It was still all fill. And I start like duck tracking. I see like little like footprints that aren't leading towards the pond, but are in fact leading down towards Merry Meeting Bay. So I like throw some cracked corn in my pockets and I head down the hill. And thankfully, one of these ducks is like pure white. And so when I get to the bottom of the hill, I survey, and about a quarter mile down the bay, there's like a little inlet, and I can see like a little speck of white. And I'm like, maybe. So the tide is out, and so I'm able to kind of like walk along the edge of where the bay is to where they are. And sure enough, all 6, no one got eaten, even though they weren't able to roost up in trees. They're all there. And so I start like sprinkling corn on the ground and encouraging them in, and they're all into it, and they all kind of like swim in, but then like, what do? You know, they weren't into following me. They didn't want to like follow me back to the house. And then I just have 6 ducks like at my feet, and anytime you try and get near them, they're like, don't touch me, and they swim back out. And so my dad, both of my parents live in Brunswick, and my dad was supposed to come over for lunch that day, and so I was like, change of plans, stop by the house and pick up the dog crate. And so he comes down with the dog crate, and my plan is that if we catch the male duck, the drake, that like maybe we can get the girls to kind of like hang around, and you know, it'll be easier. So I'm on the bay side and my dad's in the woods essentially, and we're both just like, you know, coming at this duck from different angles trying to catch it. Turns out like so difficult, and they're wily and fast, and he's like half flying, half swimming. And so we spend about an hour and a half before, of course, my mom gets involved. And she's like, I'm going to bring you some fishing nets, you know, the big long 6-foot fishing nets with the big, so that cuts the time down considerably. We managed to like get him. After 2 hours, we catch 1 duck. And my dad says, 1 out of 6 isn't bad. To which I'm just kind of like, no. A single male duck does not really get us where we're trying to go with a homestead. So we end up going out repeatedly in this like V-shaped formation, where at this point, like the tide has pretty much come back in. And, you know, at first we had been like ankle deep, and then we're knee deep. And now like I'm like armpit deep out in Merry Meeting Bay. We go out in this like V shape and herd the ducks back in towards my mom, who's on shore, with the 1 male duck in the crate. And then you have this like pinnacle moment of like, you're too close to them and everybody scatters at the same time. And like my dad's diving and I'm diving, and like my mom's just like playing goalie behind it. And after every one, my dad would be like, 2 out of 6 isn't bad. He will catch all of these ducks. So after considerable effort, we finally managed to get the last one in the dog crate. And meanwhile, Sarah has been working up in Belfast all day, even though my dad kept texting her, like, where are you? And so she's like, I'm coming back. I have pizza. I have beer. And, and so we get the ducks back in their pen. And I'm like, Sarah's coming. She has pizza. She has beer. And my parents are like, we want warm showers. And I was like, I love you guys so much. Thank you. And so they drive off, and Sarah comes back, and we drink beer and have pizza. And the most, like, every time I tell or think about this story, the one thing that like repeatedly gets me is like, over the next couple weeks, people will be like, oh, how are the ducks? And I'd be like, well, they escaped. And then Sarah would immediately chime in and be like, but they came back. And I'd be like, they did not come back. I was just like, where are they? They were forcibly caught and returned to our home. And so, needless to say, we've acquired many more animals since then, and none have had quite an adventurous first week.